welcome. We're happy to have you guys here tonight. I would like to thank our sponsor for the evening, the Elson Lecture Series. Ambassador and Mrs. Edward Elson have supported lectures here for a number of years, so tonight's lecture is an Elson lecture. Please join us for our next lecture, which features Winston Groom, and he'll be talking about his book, Vicksburg, 1863. Barry Strauss will speak for approximately 45 minutes, and then we will do a little Q&A. Can you hear me? It's on. Maybe I need to, really talk into it. Okay. He'll speak for approximately 45 minutes, and then we will take questions from the audience. Barry Strauss is professor of history and classics at Cornell University and is a leading expert on military history. Let everybody come on in. He has written and edited several books, including The Trojan War, The Battle of Salamis, and has been interviewed numerous times on television for A&E, the Discovery Channel, the History Channel, National Geographic, the BBC, and PBS. Please join me in welcoming Barry Strauss.
Thank you. I'm not sure that I'm going to work with the mic. Can you hear me without the mic? Okay, sorry about that, folks. But as I was saying, Spartacus and his fellow fighters were immigrants to Italy, and we'll see that they were very much influenced by Italian culture as well as by their native cultures. Spartacus was a celebrity, and he was a sports star. And if you'll forgive me for imposing a Yankee on you, I think we get an image of another way in which Spartacus appeared to the public. And as we shall see, his celebrity was no small part of what he was all about. And finally, Spartacus, of course, was a slave. And the overwhelming majority of the people in his revolt were also slaves. And Spartacus is a story about a slave revolt. We'll see that the way the revolt is presented in the movie is not entirely accurate. And yet, we can never forget that this is an aspect of his story as well. So, the real Spartacus. Here we have a gladiator. Let's see if this pointer works. Brilliant, it does. This is a graffito of a gladiator from right outside of Pompeii, Puteoli, ancient Puteoli, the city where Sophia Loren was born and raised. And it is just one of many, many examples we have throughout the Roman world of graffiti of gladiators, these famous, well-beloved sports figures. And Spartacus fought in arenas. This is an amphitheater that dates back to the very beginning of amphitheaters around Spartacus's period, the 1st century BC. We're talking about a revolt that begins in 73 BC, 73 years before the birth of Christ. And this amphitheater not far from Naples, well, I don't know if that Spartacus fought there, but it reflects the kind of building in which he would have fought. So to begin the story, the historical story, Spartacus was not a Roman, he was a Thracian. And Thrace is located roughly where Bulgaria is today. Spartacus came from this region of modern Bulgaria. In fact, the Bulgarians consider him a national hero. The Thracians in the ancient world had a reputation for martial valor, and particularly as horsemen. This is a Thracian jewel, a gem, and here you see the image of a man on horseback, in this case fighting animals. It's the way that the Thracians like to think of themselves as warriors and as horsemen. Another important figure in the Thracian way of war was the light-armed soldier. Thracians were great experts in light-armed combat. They were prized in the ancient world as light-armed troops. They were mountain fighters. They were organized guerrilla fighters, if you will, the kind of soldiers you'd want to use in ambushes and hit and run raids. In the 1st century BC, the Romans were engaged in a series of border wars with the Thracians. Roman province was up here in Macedonia. Thrace was the border area. The Romans constantly fighting back and forth. They made war on some Thracian tribes and allied with others. We're not exactly sure of the circumstances, but in the 70s BC, or roughly thereabouts, Spartacus was a Thracian who joined the Roman army. He served in an allied unit, probably as a cavalryman, because the Romans liked to use allies as cavalrymen and Thracians as cavalrymen. He serves as an ally in the Roman army, using his particular Thracian skills, but learning a bit about the Roman way of war, Roman tactics and doctrine, Roman ways of doing things. And then everything goes bad. Precisely how, we're not sure. One thing I should tell you in studying Spartacus is that our sources of evidence are quite poor, and we have to do a great deal of hypothesizing and pulling things together. According to one source, an unfriendly source, Spartacus deserts. He goes off and becomes a bandit, and then he's captured. Another source tells a different story. It says simply that Spartacus is fighting with the Romans in an allied unit, as you see, and he's taken captive, taken prisoner. How? We don't know, perhaps in a battle. But he ends up in the hands of a slave trader, and he's sold as a slave. Here the two sources come together. The first one, the one that says he's a deserter, we don't exactly know what that means. Some scholars suggest that perhaps Spartacus grew tired of fighting his own people and deserted and joined the anti-Roman forces. Perhaps the truth was more prosaic. He just gets captured and is sold to a slave trader. One thing we have to keep in mind about the Roman Empire is that as the Romans were conquering lands around the Mediterranean, they were exploiting them. And for the Romans, the Mediterranean was one vast reservoir of slaves. Roman society in this period was a slave society. Roman Italy had a population, it's estimated that about 20% of the population of Roman Italy was made up of slaves. These slaves mostly were in the countryside. They either worked on farms or they worked as herdsmen, because herding sheep, goats, horses, other animals, very major part of the Roman economy. And the Romans would come in and they would steal people, kidnap them, and take them off to slavery. Or they would deal with slave traders who kidnapped them as well. It is a major stain on the Roman Empire, particularly in this period. So Spartacus ends up in the hands of a slave trader. And then he's sold to the Romans. And not only sold to the Romans, but he is condemned to the most terrible fate that a slave could be given. Terrible from one point of view, but not all, as we'll see. We have a Roman source who lived in this time. He was a contemporary of Spartacus, the writer Varro. You might have heard of him as an agricultural writer, and he tells us that Spartacus was forced to become a gladiator even though he was innocent. According to Roman law, nobody would be made to be a gladiator unless he had committed some terrible crime. But Spartacus had committed no such crime. An innocent man, he is made a gladiator. Here we see a Roman stele from this period. It shows a slave sale. On a plausible interpretation, one of the figures here is the merchant of slaves. The other one perhaps is the buyer. And here on a pedestal we see the poor fellow who's being sold as a slave himself. You'll see that he's wearing only a loincloth and that he's represented as smaller than the two free men. This is an ideological statement, not a representation of reality. This stele comes from the city of Capua. And Capua is where Spartacus was enslaved. Here, more on that in a second, but here we have some manacles, chains used by slaves in ancient Italy. Spartacus in the movie, if you may recall, that Kirk Douglas says that he's a slave who's the son of a slave and the grandson of a slave, third generation of slaves. But the real Spartacus was not a person of that fate. He'd been a free man who ends up unfairly in slavery after serving in the Roman army. He's less like Kirk Douglas and Spartacus than Russell Crowe in Gladiator, who, as the General Maximus, was at the height of the Roman tree. Oops. Well, Spartacus is brought to Rome, and that's where he is sold to a gladiatorial entrepreneur, a man named Cornelius Lentulus Vatia. And from Rome, he is brought south to Capua. Here, roughly, is, let's see, here is Capua, and Rome is up here. So he's brought south 125 miles, the city of Capua, where, this is the amphitheater at Capua, and in Capua, Spartacus is trained to be a gladiator. In particular, he's trained to be a heavyweight gladiator, one of the most prestigious and popular of the different kinds of gladiators. And the Romans would have known the different kinds of gladiators just as we today know the different players in baseball or football, basketball, hockey, soccer, what have you. A heavyweight gladiator called a murmillo, and this fellow over here is that sort of gladiator. Fought with a large shield and a standard sword, the gladius. Here you see the sword. Here is a gladiatorial barracks, roughly from this period. It's not from Capua, it's from Pompeii. It's the old gladiatorial barracks. And you can see that security was an issue for the Romans with gladiators. The sidewalk is raised here. You won't find a sidewalk like this anywhere else in Pompeii, raised so far from the ground. And you can see there's very careful access to and from this place, and there's a wall around it. That's because the people inside were dangerous. They were men who were trained to fight and kill with swords. They had the same kind of training that Roman legionaries would have. The weapons were held up under lock and key. There were guards, and the men were carefully separated from their weapons. Their life was very difficult, and their life expectancy, of course, was short. Very few gladiators made it very long once they went into service. But by the standards of Roman slavery, the gladiators were not all that poorly off. They slept with a roof under their head. They had a room of their own or a room that they shared. And above all, gladiators were allowed to have wives. They were even encouraged to have wives. It was thought to anchor them, to give them something to fight for. And Spartacus is one such example. Spartacus has a wife, whether she is his legal wife or a common law wife, we don't know. Like him, she is a Thracian. She comes from the same tribe as he does. We don't know her name, unfortunately, so I refer to her just as the Thracian lady. We do know that she was religious. Probably she was tattooed, because Thracians, particularly the religious ones, would have tattoos. This is a representation on a Greek vase of a Thracian woman. You can see her tattoos. And this woman, like Spartacus's lady, was a worshiper of the god Dionysus. Now, Dionysus is one of the most ubiquitous and protean gods of the ancient world. We know him mostly as the god of wine, but he's also the national god of Thrace, and he is the god of liberation. Slaves and oppressed people in the ancient world who are dreaming of their freedom pray to Dionysus. And Dionysus was a popular god in Italy in particular, as a god of the lower classes. Our sources tell us that the Thracian lady went into ecstatic trances. And she has a trance in which the god speaks to her. And she sees Spartacus being sold into slavery in Rome, and a miracle happens. While he's sleeping, a snake wraps itself around his head. Why a snake? Well, here we have a Roman representation of Dionysus. It's a fresco from Pompeii. You can see that he's covered with grapes as the god of wine, and the characteristic symbol of Dionysus is there, the snake. The snake wraps itself around Spartacus' head, and this means that Spartacus, as the Thracian lady says, is going to do great and fearsome things. Great and fearsome things. It's a call to arms. Spartacus has been chosen by Dionysus to lead the oppressed. It begins in the gladiatorial barracks. 200 men join a conspiracy to revolt. They're going to get their arms and break out, kill the guards and break out of the barracks. But before they can, the conspiracy is discovered. And most of them are cordoned off. But 74 of them manage to break out. They don't have any weapons. They can't get to their swords. Instead, they use kitchen utensils, knives and skewers. And they use these knives and skewers. They kill the guards. They break out of the barracks. And they head south. 20 miles south of Capua is a mountain that ironically is illustrated in the same fresco. It's Mount Vesuvius. And that's where the slaves make their refuge. Here we see Capua, and here's Vesuvius. A little further from Vesuvius is Pompeii. I can't see it very well on this map. I think this is it. This is Pompeii. Here's the Amalfi Coast, if you know it. Here's Naples. Here's Salerno, where the Allies landed in 1943. And Rome is up over there. So they go to Vesuvius. Why Vesuvius? Well, here you see a picture of Vesuvius from Pompeii. Pompeii is a very wealthy city. There are a series of wealthy cities around the Gulf of Naples, around this area. Pompeii, we think of Pompeii today as the great volcano that erupted and destroyed Pompeii. But Vesuvius, that in 73 BC, that was 150 years off. In 73 BC, Vesuvius was a dormant volcano. And its volcanic soil made it one of the most fertile places in Italy. It is surrounded by farms, very wealthy and well-stocked farms. And Spartacus and his men start raiding the farms. Their base is on top of the mountain, and they raid the farms lower down. The slaves in this area get the word of what's going on, and they come to join Spartacus by the tens, by the hundreds, perhaps by the thousands. Meanwhile, back in Rome, so maybe 145 miles away, the Romans get word that there's a slave revolt in Italy. This is a statue of a Roman patrician holding the busts of his ancestors, meant to look suitably dignified. The Romans look down on slave revolts. They know they're serious business. There's been slave revolts in Sicily, quite serious slave revolts. But by the same token, the Romans consider slaves to be beneath their dignity. Putting down a slave revolt is not the thing that will lead to a great political career or to military glory. Nor will it lead to great loot, because this is a war in Italy, and you can't rob from your own people in Italy. So the Romans are loath to send a large army to put down this rebellion. On top of that, the Romans have a problem. The problem is the Middle East. The Romans are busy. They are fighting an enormous revolt that has been going on now for 15 years. It's a revolt centered in what is nowadays Turkey, led by a man named King Mithridates, from here, Mithridates of Pontus. The revolt has spilled over into western Turkey and even across the Sea of Marmara into Thrace and down into Greece. And the Romans, in one way or another, have been involved with this revolt for a long time. Their armies are there. They also have armies in Spain putting down a revolt there. And they also have to deal with the pirates off Crete. They've stripped Italy of the cream of its manpower. They don't want to recruit more men. They don't want to spend the money on coming up with a new army. And so they decide that they're going to fight Spartacus on the cheap. They're going to use a small army, the equivalent of the National Guard, the militia. 6,000 men under a relatively high officer. They send them down to trumpets blaring in the spring or summer of 73 BC to deal with Spartacus. They think it's going to be an easy job. The rebels are on Vesuvius. Vesuvius is a mountain. There's only one road up the mountainside. They think that all they have to do is block this road and their troubles will be over. They'll starve the rebels out. But they are not reckoning with Spartacus and his natural genius. Here we have a man who's had only limited military training. He hasn't gone to any academy. He hasn't been trained in the art of generalship. And yet Spartacus has learned enough to be able to put together a successful operation to take the Romans by surprise. Rather than taking the road down the mountain, Spartacus gets his men to weave ropes out of the wild vines that grow naturally on Vesuvius. I worked with an Italian scientist who worked with a local farmer, and we weaved together, they weaved some vine ropes in the traditional manner. And here you can see my friend rappelling down the mountainside of Vesuvius. Probably there were too many men and the ropes weren't strong enough to allow much rappelling. They probably would have used them more as handholds. But one day in the summer, when the Romans were not expecting it, Spartacus and his entire army went down the mountainside, took them by surprise, attacked their camp, and destroyed the Roman army of 6,000 men and sent the Roman general packing. At this point, the legend of Spartacus is growing. Here is this Thracian, this barbarian, this gladiator who's defeated a Roman army. Now, the road lies open to southern Italy. Spartacus and his men start raiding all around this very wealthy area south of Capua and south of Vesuvius. They set their sights along this road, the Via Popillia, also known as the Via Annia, this road that skirts the coast and leads down to Rhegium and Sicily. This is an area rich in farms and shepherds. And Spartacus knows that these shepherds are excellent recruits for his army. Why shepherds? Well, in the Roman world in this period, shepherds are slaves, but they're particular kinds of slaves. They're hardy, they're independent, they're allowed to carry arms, and their masters leave them alone. They make natural-born insurgents, natural-born guerrilla soldiers. And Spartacus now attracts them to his banner. His army grows. It's up to tens of thousands of men. And the Romans put together new forces, new militias are sent south to defeat the rebels. But again and again, by hook or by crook, by ambushes and tricks and surprise attacks, again and again, the rebels defeat the Romans. We're now into the fall of 73 BC. The rebels are raiding the farms in this area of Italy. This is a farm that was covered by the lava of the eruption of Vesuvius, and it's been excavated and recreated in something like what it was in ancient times. These are vines in winter, so they look very bare. This is a coin hoard that was buried in 72 BC in southern Italy. It's a reasonable hypothesis that it was buried to protect the coins from Spartacus and his raids. Here you can see the jar that it was buried in. So the rebels are doing well against the Romans, but they now face a dilemma, the dilemma of success. What should they do with this success? Most of the men in Spartacus's army think what they should do with this success is to continue doing what they've been doing, to continue raiding the Italian countryside and gathering loot and gaining supporters. But Spartacus thinks differently. Spartacus is able to think strategically, and Spartacus understands that if the revolt continues to be successful, the Romans will not allow it to thrive. The Romans will bring back soldiers from Turkey and from Spain. They'll do what's necessary to suppress the slave revolt. And so Spartacus says to his men, let us leave Italy. Let us go north. Let's take the road north. Let's go up to the Alps. Let's cross the Alps, and let's go home. Where is home? For Spartacus and many of his supporters, home is Thrace, Bulgaria. But our sources tell us that the Thracians were not the majority in Spartan's army. His army is made up of slaves, a hodgepodge of slaves, who come from three main areas. Thrace is one, Germany is the second, and the Celtic lands is the third. The Celtic lands in this period, from the point of view of the Romans, would have been Gaul, that is to say roughly France and Belgium, and the Balkans, because there's large populations of Celts in the Balkans. This piece of art shows a Celtic warrior, a Gaul, in fact, fighting against a Roman legionary and wielding a gladius, much as Spartacus might have. And these three groups, the Celts, the Germans, and the Thracians, do not agree. Most of the Thracians are willing to follow Spartacus out of Italy over the Alps and homeward. But the Gauls and the Germans are not. They want to stay in Italy and continue to fight. A very ugly incident follows, still in the autumn of 73 BC. It takes place here in a mountain valley of southern Italy, maybe about 50 miles south of Naples. It's a place called Forum Anni, a small farm town. And there one day, in the season of harvest, a massacre takes place. Spartacus and men who a Roman source describes as noble, prudent, mindful of their homeland, they want to go home and they want to treat the locals well. The majority of the rebels have no interest in going home. They want vengeance. And so in this farming valley, in the fall of 73 BC, at dawn, they sneak up on this town, Forum Anni. They kill the children and the men. They rape the women. They ignore Spartacus's pleas to behave well, to treat civilians fairly. And they announce that they're not going home, they're staying in Italy, and this is the kind of rebellion they're going to lead. Spartacus decides to stay and to try to bring some order into this chaos. He and his men, he persuades the men to go further south, all the way to the heel of the Italian boot, to a place called Thurii, a very fertile plain where they'll spend the winter of 73 to 72 BC. And there, he wants to try to train them to become more of a regular army, capable of fighting the Romans in different situations. So they spend the winter there. Here is a view, an overview of the plain. And here's another picture of the city of Thurii. Here is a Roman road from this period. They're spending the winter in this warm and fertile place. In the spring of 72, the army marches again. Spartacus and his fellow leaders decide to split up. The Thracians and some of the Germans and Celts will march northward under Spartacus. The Gauls decide to stay in southern Italy. The Romans send two armies out against the rebels. One of them goes against the Gauls and picks them off in the vicinity of this peninsula over here and defeats them. Spartacus and his men continue marching northwards, defeating the Romans in battle after battle, escaping from them and then turning on them and defeating them until they get all the way north to the plain of the Po River, not far from Milan, outside the city of Mutina, the Roman name for what nowadays is Modena. They defeat yet another Roman army, and Spartacus says to his men, "This is it, guys. Here's the Alps. We can cross the Alps. We can go home." But the men refuse. And I imagine Spartacus facing now the fact that he's not going to be able to bring his army home. He needs to stay in Italy if he's going to be loyal to it. I imagine him like a character in another well-known movie saying, "Just when I thought I was out, they dragged me back in." And so Spartacus, in the summer of 72, marches back southwards, all the way back to Thurii in southern Italy, after having gone on this long march up and down the peninsula. It's at this point that his prophecy comes true. Indeed, the Romans are not willing to let the slave revolt continue forever. There's 60,000 soldiers in Spartacus' army, plus countless numbers of women and children. And some of the women were actually, at least, if not wielding weapons themselves, close to the combat. And we can talk about that in the Q&A. The Romans decide they need to do something about it. In Rome, in the Senate House, they meet, and the senators do what they hadn't wanted to do. They turn to a political enemy of theirs, a representative of the common people, a very ambitious man, a skilled general, the richest man in Rome, a tremendous disciplinarian, the one man who is felt might be able to save the situation. His name, Marcus Licinius Crassus. And this is a bust of him, played by Laurence Olivier in the movie. Crassus has the connections to bring some of Rome's veterans out of retirement. And he has the money to add to the tax money that's being used to pay the troops. So he creates a new army, an army 45,000 men strong. It's a very big army by ancient standards. It's as big as the army that Caesar uses to conquer Gaul 20 years later. And he takes this army in November of 72 BC, and he marches it southward beyond Capua to the region of, beyond Capua to the region around Salerno, right around here. He camps beneath these hills. I'd like to point out that this plain is the area in Italy today where the best mozzarella cheese comes from. You now buy it in American supermarkets. It's outside the town of Eboli, also known for a novel and a movie, Christ Stopped at Eboli. And there he trains his men to fight Spartacus. They engage in a skirmish with Spartacus at first, and they're defeated ignominiously. And Crassus now shows that he is capable of making his men fear him more than they fear the rebels. He readapts, he reintroduces an old Roman disciplinary custom, decimation. When the army misbehaves, you take every 10th man, you go, you, come here. And you take the other men, and you say it's the job of the other men to beat the 10th man to death. Depending on who you believe, they take 50 men or 500 men and beat them to death. This makes Crassus's point. You can be afraid of Spartacus, but you had better be afraid of me furthermore than Spartacus. Whether it's the one thing that does the trick, we don't know. It's useful propaganda for Crassus, an ambitious man, but in any case, the tide begins to turn. And now the Roman army starts inflicting defeats on Spartacus. We have a modern recreation of a Roman legionary. The confrontations between Spartacus and Crassus take place up here in the northern, just out of this map. And in the winter of 72 BC, let us say in December of 72, Spartacus starts heading south fast. His men have now got the message that Spartacus was right all along. They've got to leave Italy. But it's no longer an option to go north. The Romans have closed the road north. So instead, they're going to go south. The plan is to cross over into Sicily, across the Strait of Messina. In this area where the Strait of Messina is about 1.5 miles wide. Why Sicily? Well, Sicily was a Roman province. It wasn't part of Italy politically. It was governed by a Roman governor. It had been conquered by the Romans. Sicily had had 2 great slave revolts, 30-year cycles. 30 years before Spartacus, there had been one. 30 years before that, there had been another. Spartacus had good intelligence, and he figured that Sicily was ripe for a 3rd slave revolt. Perhaps he could find supporters there, or if nothing else, he could use Sicily as a stepping stone to get further away from the Romans. How's he going to get to Sicily? He needs ships. He doesn't have any. Fortunately for Spartacus, ships are available. This area, the Strait of Messina, is also one of the prime locations for piracy in this period. There are lots of pirates in the area, and among the many things we can say about the pirates in this period of history is they hate the Romans. Spartacus initiates contact with the pirates, and they offer to ferry his men to safety. All they want in return is a small deposit. And the rebels have now gotten enough loot that they are able to comply and to give the pirates a small deposit. And then, pirates are pirates. They take the money and run. They sail off, leaving Spartacus and his men high and dry. They're pirates, but perhaps also they are no fools. They know that while Spartacus has been ravaging southern Italy, the Roman governor of Sicily has fortified the shores, making it very difficult to land and making the pirates' enterprise a very dangerous one indeed. No pirates, no ships. What's Spartacus going to do? He's a very resourceful person, and he has his men build rafts. We're going to build rafts, and we'll cross the strait ourselves. If it had been the summer, it might have worked. But it's winter, say January. The sea is extremely stormy in the Strait of Messina in the winter, and when the rafts go out, they capsize, they crash into each other. It is a total disaster. And so now, and this is the strait, you can see this guy's on one shore, here's the other. Pretty narrow, but this is a summer day. It's not so difficult to cross. Now Spartacus has no choice except to turn north. Maybe something will turn up. Maybe he can get to another port, find other ships, other pirates, somehow, a mountain fastness where he can escape to. The problem is that Crassus has studied the counter-insurgency manual. If Crassus had access to General Petreius, and if Crassus had known that he was leading a surge Roman style, he would have known that the rule book says what you do with insurgents is you cut them off from sources of escape and support. He's cut them off in the Strait of Messina, and he now decides to cut them off on land. The Italian peninsula is at its narrowest at this point. It's about 35 miles wide by road. The modern road follows more or less the line of the ancient road. It's also a very rugged and mountainous area that has deep natural gorges. Crassus takes advantage of that to have his men build a series of fortifications between the gorges to close off this part of the Italian boot. A 35-mile-long fortress, part natural, part man-made, a system of walls and trenches and man-made trenches as well, holding Spartacus back. And it's there, in the winter of 71 BC, let's say February, that Spartacus is trapped by the Romans. He's got to break through, otherwise his army will starve. Even though he's got a large area to the south, it's not a particularly fertile area. This is the area we're talking about. You can see the gorges. Traces of Crassus's fortifications, or to be honest, what may be Crassus's fortifications, they have not been properly excavated, exist up here on this plateau. And I and many other scholars believe that the confrontation between the two armies took place up in this plateau. Spartacus is one cagey fellow and an expert in mountain fighting. He waits for a bitter night, a night of snow, when the Romans, being Mediterraneans, think no sensible person would be out fighting in this weather. They don't reckon with Spartacus. He fills in the trenches between his army and the Romans, not the natural gorge, but the man-made trenches. He fills them in with brushwood and debris and corpses. And he marches his army through. They break through the Roman lines, and they escape. Spartacus wants to head north. He's down here. He wants to head north to the mountains of Samnium. Samnium is an area of traditional hostility to the Romans. He figures he might find some allies there. But before he can get there, he runs into other problems. First problem is that his army splits up again. Things have not gone well for the last few months, and once again the Celts decide to break off, to form their own breakaway army. So the army splits in two. Second, Crassus is following these two groups. He's hot on their heels. Third thing that happens is that the Romans recall parts of their armies from the east and the west. Part of the army of Spain is marching down from the north. Spartacus doesn't know that. But what he does know is that part of the army of the east is landing at the port of Brundisium, modern Brindisi. And Spartacus feels as if he's being caught in a trap. Indeed, he is. He never makes it to Samnium. The Celts are defeated in a battle that probably takes place around here, not far from Salerno. And Spartacus and his men decide that their only hope really is one last heroic battle against the Romans. They're trapped. They realize that their chances of defeating the legions are slim. And yet, there is one final hope. The battle probably takes place in the valley of the Solaris River. That's the ancient name. It's the modern Sele River. We don't know exactly where it takes place, but some have suggested this area. You can see that this is an area of rich farmland and very rugged mountains in the distance. It's the spring of 71 BC, perhaps March. Spartacus' strategy, his plan for the battle, is that he will aim for the head. He will aim for Crassus. He and a small group of men will use their skill as gladiators to cut through the general's guard. They want to kill Crassus, decapitate the Roman army, and hope that this will lead to a panic that will allow them to win, even though they're outnumbered and outclassed by the legionaries. We have several accounts of what happened in the ancient historians. We can't be sure if these accounts are true or not, but if we believe them, Spartacus fights heroically. He kills a number of Romans. He kills 2 centurions. These are important lower officers, second lieutenants, if you will. He kills them himself, fighting with his sword. Spartacus is no general to lead from the rear until he is surrounded, wounded in his thigh, according to one source. He falls, he's killed, he's lost. The tide of battle turns. Crassus and the Romans grind down on the rebels and defeat them. There are large casualties. Every rebel who can escapes into the hills of the Pisantine Mountains. Crassus and the Romans follow them. They follow them into the hills, and they capture large numbers of them. They capture at least 6,000 of them. And they take those 6,000, they march them north to Capua, perhaps about 50 miles from where they are, and then they take them along the main highway between Capua, the cradle of the revolt, and Rome, 125 miles away. And they engage in a demonstration to warn all the slaves of Italy never to do anything like this again. They take those 6,000 people, probably including women and children as well as men, and they crucify them. This is the punishment for rebel slaves, and Spartacus and his men knew them. They take them, they erect crosses along the road, possibly the Appian Way, and that is how that spring is commemorated. It's a terrible ending for the revolt that began with such high hopes. What went wrong in the revolt? It's clear. Spartacus had the intelligence. He had the skill and the brain power to understand the strategy that was needed against the Romans. It was not possible for Spartacus and his men to conquer Italy or to free all the slaves of Italy. The only thing that was possible for them was, after having built an army, to escape abroad, to live to fight the Romans again another day. Instead, but Spartacus did not have the political strength, perhaps not the political skill, certainly not the power to persuade his men what needed to be done. They didn't listen to him. Eventually, what he expected would happen did happen, and the Romans mastered the art of counterinsurgency. What happened to Spartacus, to the idea of Spartacus in antiquity? What happened to Roman slaves? Well, very quickly. Slavery lasts for several more centuries. And slowly, over time, it becomes less onerous, but not right away. Right away, the lesson that the Romans take from this revolt is to increase security, to beef up security, particularly with gladiators, to make sure this would never happen again, and as we've already seen, to maintain, to engage in acts of brutality to make their point. Spartacus is remembered by the Romans. They never forget him. Cicero, Caesar, Horace, Tacitus, even St. Augustine all talk about Spartacus. He's a lasting image. But what about the slaves of the Roman world? Did they remember Spartacus? Well, the answer, alas, is we don't know. Slaves didn't get to leave records. They didn't get to talk. But I want to leave you with one last image of Spartacus in this revolt. It is a fresco that was discovered in Pompeii in the 1920s. It looks like a cartoon, as you can see. On the left side of the fresco, there are 2 gladiators fighting on foot. And on the right side of the fresco, there are 2 gladiators fighting on horseback. And on the far right, there is a trumpeter wearing a bear mask. The fighters are all labeled. We can't read these names. This guy's name can be read as Felix. There's only one name that we can read. So this guy on the extreme right. We can read his name. It's not written in Latin or Greek. It's written in a native Italian language called Oscan. And for reasons that are complicated to get into, Oscan is a language of protest against Rome. And what is the guy's name? Would anyone care to guess? Spartacus. Is this a memory of Spartacus? Is this a way for the Oscan speakers to thumb their to thumb the Romans' eyes? Perhaps. There's some problems with dating this fresco. It's not easy to date it after Spartacus' revolt. For various complicated reasons, it would be easier to date it before Spartacus' revolt. And yet, the date isn't certain. And the meaning of this isn't certain. There's room for scholarly debate. I'd like to leave you with the thought that somehow in their hearts and minds, the slaves of Italy remembered Spartacus and looked at him as a source of inspiration, a possibility of freedom while they suffered under the yoke of Roman slavery. Thank you. I'd be happy to take questions. Sir.
Would you care to speculate why Spartacus did not lead his force towards Rome?
Yes. There was talk of Spartacus leading his force towards Rome. Rome was an impregnable fortress, and Spartacus, as a good soldier, knew it. He didn't have the equipment, the siege equipment. He didn't have the numbers to deal with Rome. Not even Hannibal was able to storm Rome. I think Spartacus, who had a much weaker base than Hannibal, a much less skilled army, had no chance at all of taking the city of Rome. All that he could have done was a demonstration against the Romans. So I think that's why he doesn't attack it.
Do you think that was really Spartacus's intent when he broke out, that he was in fact going to free the slaves in Italy, or was that just an effort?
Well, I think that's an excellent question. I think Spartacus was a very sophisticated and intelligent person. And I think the movie has it wrong. The movie makes it look as if Spartacus decides to break out of these barracks because he's just so angry and because Gene Simmons, his lady love, is being mistreated. That's not my sense of Spartacus. My sense of Spartacus is of a very shrewd, strategic thinker who has an idea what he's doing. I think when he breaks out of the barracks, he's after bigger game. I don't think he's planning to free all the slaves of Italy. I think he knows that's impossible. But to create an army of ex-slaves, an insurgent army that can do some damage in Italy and then escape, he couldn't be guaranteed that that's what he could do, but I think that he had good reason to think this was within the realm of possibility. There'd been enough slave revolts in the past. He saw how the Romans behaved. He knew that the best Roman troops were abroad. I think he was the kind of person who could have reasonably counted on achieving something like that.
Creating the army, did Spartacus create a hierarchy of subordinate officers?
Yes. We know that there were at least 3 generals at the top, Spartacus and 2 Celtic generals, the guys named Crixus and Enemaeus. Our sources disagree as to whether they were a troika of equals or whether Spartacus was on the top and they were below him. But in a way, it doesn't really matter because with insurgent armies, it's not so much a matter of established ranks as to who can persuade the men to follow him. So I think we should imagine that Spartacus and the Celts and the Germans were constantly vying, and that this army was almost a living force. It's not going to follow the institutional chain of command that a modern regular army will have. Certainly below that, there are going to be other men who are leading smaller units of the army. Spartacus had been a professional soldier. He knew how armies worked. And there's every reason to think there were other slaves who had been prisoners of war who knew how armies worked. They'd also seen the discipline of the gladiatorial school. So although we don't have evidence of second lieutenants and sergeants in the army, it's very reasonable to hypothesize that there were such.
Is it true that the Roman army included people who were of the countries that they had conquered?
Yes. The Roman army in this period was largely an army made of Italians and Romans, some original Roman citizens, some Italians who had been conquered for hundreds of years, although they had recently rebelled. Those were the infantry. There are smaller units of cavalry and specialized troops, archers, slingers, siege troops, horsemen above all, who were made up of the people who they had conquered. These, unlike the legions, these are not regular units. They would be created for temporary purposes as needed, recruited from the locals, and then they would be disbanded. And that's the kind of unit that almost certainly Spartacus served in.
Three just quick questions.
Sure.
You referred to slavery as a stain on the Roman Empire.
Yes.
Can you explain why you think it was a stain? Two, the
Those are three great questions. So first question is, why do I consider slavery to be a stain on the Roman Empire? Well, because the Romans, in conquering the Mediterranean, were enslaving literally millions of innocent people. The Romans were in league with pirates and kidnappers who were roaming the eastern Mediterranean in particular in this period and enslaving free people. Slavery can never be justified, but at least there's a kind of honor among thieves, if you will, in which you fight somebody, you lose, you're prisoners of war, you're enslaved. But that's not what the Romans were doing. They were going after vast numbers of civilians and bringing them into slavery, and also treating them really miserably in this period. Later on, they begin to treat them considerably better. That's the first question. The second question, language. No, there is no common language in this period. In large parts of the eastern Mediterranean speak Greek, or at least city dwellers speak Greek. Greek is not as common in the countryside. In Italy, Latin is spreading as a language, but by no means is Italy a Latin-speaking peninsula. It's a mosaic of languages in this period. If you do business with the Romans, you have to speak some Latin, and undoubtedly the gladiators would all speak some Latin. But some of them, quite a few of them, I think, would be less than fluent in Latin. Third question is, how certain am I? I would say that I'm about 2/3 certain, so 66%. Considerable amount that I'm not certain about. But the way I think ancient history needs to be practiced is that by getting experts who study with a wide view of how things work in the ancient world, you can take imperfect evidence and say, okay, we can fill in the blanks with hypothesis because we know the way things worked in the ancient world. In some cases, we can fill in the blanks with a real degree of certainty. In other cases, we're not so certain. All we can say is this is a credible explanation. And it's a different way than we might look at things today. But as experts in antiquity, we can explain why it's more credible. What I try to do in my book is to say in different places, this is certain, this is possible, this is probable, so on and so forth.
How did you become so interested in this character?
Spartacus? 2 reasons. First, the movie. I saw the movie as a kid, and it lasted. And when I went to look a few years ago at what the great standard book on Spartacus was, I discovered there wasn't any. And that's because most historians don't want to write about someone who's just so enigmatic and where the evidence is so imperfect. Second, I think 9/11 and the war on terrorism. To me, it opened a possibility of looking at Spartacus in a different way than we were used to. Because the primary way of looking at Spartacus, certainly the way I had learned in graduate school, was to see this as an example of a slave revolt and to see it in more or less Marxist categories. And I thought, there's an entirely different way to look at it. So those were the 2 inspirations for looking at it in a different way. Spartacus is the earliest sources we have about Spartacus are 2 contemporaries, 2 Romans who are alive at the time. One is Varro, and the other is Sallust. That's the good news. 2 other contemporaries write about Spartacus, Cicero and Caesar. They also write about Spartacus. That's the good news. The bad news is we're talking about a sentence here and a sentence there. Cicero and Caesar write very little about Spartacus. Varro has 1 sentence that survives about Spartacus. Sallust writes a book about Spartacus, but most of it is gone. And all we have is bits and pieces. We have about maybe 7 to 10 pages of that book. But these 7 to 10 pages have been dissected over and over again by scholars. Later on, in antiquity, we have longer accounts of Spartacus. The 2 best ones date to about 200 years later. They read other sources that existed at the time. And we can try to reconstruct what those other sources said. But that's the difficult evidence that we have to work with as historians. There's also a small amount of archaeological evidence, which is helpful in reconstructing things. But it's definitely a case of detective work. We have to piece things together.
From listening to you, I got the impression that the so-called slavery class was a significant percentage percentage of the overall population of Italy.
Absolutely.
And I was wondering if that percentage would later influence Italian politics even as far as the 20th century.
Well, certainly genetically, yes. I mean, these slaves, before antiquity is over, all the slaves are freed. Slavery is abolished in Italy. But to make a long story short, within a century or so after Spartacus, the Romans already were beginning to free slaves. Manumission was much more of a possibility in ancient Italy than it was in modern slave systems. So you already have a small percentage of slaves, particularly urban slaves, who are being manumitted. What happens as the age of conquest, the age of slave trading dies down, is that you get a larger proportion of slaves who are being manumitted. So you get a large class of freemen. Furthermore, it's one thing to be kidnapped in Thrace and to sold in slavery in Rome. It's another thing to be born in the Italian countryside of Thracian parents. You forget the language. You start speaking Latin. You use Roman customs. You become an immigrant, whether you like it or not. And that's the other story that's happening to Roman slavery. So by the end of the empire, an overwhelming percentage of Italians are going to be descended from slaves in one form or another. But that's still a long way off. It's an excellent question, and of course we don't know the answer, but I hypothesize it as follows. We know that he couldn't convince his men to go. They're not going to cross the mountains. Different theories as to why they don't cross the mountains. One theory is they got word that the war against Rome in the East isn't going so well, and they don't want to go home. Another theory is they were doing too well in Italy. They keep winning. Why should they leave? They are, after all, in the bank. Italy is the wealthiest place in the Mediterranean in this period of history. And it's slim picking. The pickings are there for the taking. There's no cops. Why leave? And the third thing is, if you stand on the plain of the Po and look up at the Alps, it's pretty darn scary. But why didn't Spartacus just leave himself? Why didn't he say, see ya, it was fun, I'm going? Well, aside from the fact that his chances going off with a small group in the mountains wouldn't be so great, I think Spartacus was an ambitious man. And on some level, an idealistic man. The Roman sources emphasize his idealism. It's unusual for the Romans, not totally unique, but unusual. And some scholars ask, why did the Romans do this? Why do they say such nice things about this man who caused them so much trouble? Some say the Roman elite authors use this as a stick to beat their enemies with. See how good Spartacus was? You guys are bums, because you couldn't beat him. But there are others who say, and I like to think that they're right, that they said Spartacus was idealistic because Spartacus was idealistic. He was a very unusual figure. And my own sense in having studied this story is I find that inescapable. If he'd just been cynical, if he'd just been ruthless, he had lots of ways to get out. He could have killed those other chieftains who quarreled with him. He didn't have to stop his men from raping the women and pillaging and misbehaving. He could have just said, go for it. He's got ideals, and I think that's part of the key to who he is and why he's so fascinating even today. I think so. Hollywood has not come calling, but I can tell you that Starz TV is doing a new series on Spartacus that's supposed to debut this fall. Who knows what it'll be like. My next book is Three Generals. It's a study of Alexander, Hannibal, and Caesar. What they got right, what they got wrong, and what we can learn from them.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.